I cannot believe that it has been 2 years since we've been able to gather in a place like this. And to be here at Milligan College is just such a special thing for me. Whenever I was in high school, this is actually where my youth minister brought our youth group to CIY. I remember one year I was sitting right over there on the third or fourth row towards the aisle, and I decided in that seat that I was going to give my life to ministry, and that was over 20 years ago now. And so this place just holds such a special spot in my heart, and I am so stinking excited to be here with all of you this week. It's going to be a great week. It really, really is. One thing that I love to do is I love to introduce people. And I do not love to introduce people because I think I'm good at introducing people. I'm probably really not very good at introducing people, but I still love it. And I think the reason that I love it is I love to be able to dig into the personal background that I have with somebody that would, warrant me introducing them to some kind of an audience. I love reading their bios and finding out about their awards and their achievements, looking for those little weird things that kind of just make a person interesting. And so I love being able to introduce people, but something that I've learned over the years is that the deeper relationship that I have with a person, the harder it is for me to introduce them. And maybe you're not that way, but I asked a couple of people, like, am I really, really strange in this? And at least a couple of people agreed with me that the deeper relationship that you have with a person, the harder it is to introduce them. I had this conversation a couple of months ago. I was riding in a car with one of my buddies, and if you look back at my life, like, I have so many stories that my dad was front and center in my life, and good things, bad things, fun things, painful things, all of it. But my dad was just such a central figure. And so my buddy, as we were driving one day, he said, "Hey, Andy, I hear you talk about your dad all the time. Why don't you tell me about your mom?" And honestly, it was like the first time in my life that somebody said, "Introduce your mom to me. Tell me about your mom." And all of a sudden, my brain went blank. I mean, what do you say? So I ended up trying to gather some words, and I said, she's a fighter. She's a protector. She is fiercely loyal. She has shown more grace in her life than anybody I've ever met, and I mean that. And all of that is true, but all of that is also incomplete. Do you want to know who the hardest person is for me to introduce? It's my wife. I mean, how in the world am I supposed to put into words who this woman is and what it is that she means to me? This summer, we will have been married for 17 years. She's been my better half for more than 18 years now. And any time that I'm asked to introduce her, regardless of the environment, regardless of what's taking place, I struggle so badly to just try and come up with some words to make anything make sense. Because no matter what it is that I come up with, it all just seems incomplete. I mean, she's so humble, she's so kind, she loves her family to a point that I literally can't even describe it. She is selfless. I mean, I do not know of hardly any moments in her entire life where she has put herself in front of another person. She's a problem solver. She's beautiful. I love her eyes. I love to make her laugh. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce to you Heather Turner. I mean, it just doesn't work. But that's all that I have. But the things that I know about her and the things that mean the most to me about her are not necessarily the things that you would find under awards and achievements in her bio. So everything, whenever I try to introduce her, it all sounds so big and it sounds so broad, but the only reason for that is that I'm trying to capture more than my limited vocabulary will allow with just a few short words. And whenever I look at the beginning of John's gospel, I wonder if he's running into some of that as well as he tries to introduce Jesus. I mean, how in the stink do you introduce Jesus? What words do you use? How do you introduce the one who has called you? How do you introduce the one who has challenged you? How do you introduce the one who has loved you, who has changed you, who has saved you? How do you introduce God in the flesh? John decided to do it like this. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. And with these first few sentences, John, he gives us such a great foundation of what it means to know who Jesus is. The first thing that he does is he points us back to the very beginning. And not just to the beginning of Jesus' life here on this earth, but like to the very beginning, way before Bethlehem, all the way back to the creation of the world, whenever he uses the words, in the beginning. If you go to Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, those will be the first words that you read. In the beginning, God created. And this is such an important piece of information that John gives us about Jesus. He says that in the beginning was the Word. And the word here that John uses to introduce Jesus, and this is the second thing that we notice, the word that he uses here is the word logos. And we know that words are so powerful. Every single one of us in this world in this room have been built up in some form by words. And every single one of us in this room have been torn down by words. But as John uses this word to describe Jesus, as he uses this word logos to describe Jesus, he's doing something so profound that if we're not careful, we'll miss it. John knows that his audience is big. He's no longer just talking to a Jewish audience. This relationship with God thing is no longer just a Jewish thing, but it's also now a Gentile thing. But he's not just speaking to a Gentile audience. And so he had to come up with this perfect word to try and describe who it is that Jesus is. And he came up with the word logos. And to the Jewish listener, whenever they hear John say this, their mind is immediately going to go back to the creation story, to that spoken word of God, the spoken word of God to where God said, and let there be light, and there was light. The word of God that allowed the land and the sea to exist, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. For us to be here, the moon and the stars, the word of God that created all of those things is what the Jewish listener is going to hear whenever he says, in the beginning was the Word. But to the Gentile listener, whenever they hear this, in the beginning was the Word, this word logos, they're going to hear something a little bit different. They're going to hear a word that encapsulates and encompasses all life, all meaning, and all purpose. And so in Jesus, we have the creator of everything, the one who has all the power in his voice to do whatever it is that needs to be done. The creator of all life and all meaning and all purpose. But the third thing that John does is he tells us about Jesus' deity. Not that Jesus was a God, but that Jesus is the God. That Jesus was present in, and involved in creation, to the point that he says that nothing in all creation was made without Jesus' involvement. And whenever I read these words, it reminds me of something that the Apostle Paul says in Philippians chapter 2. Paul says this, he says that Jesus, who being in very nature God, and whenever I think of that, I think about my own life. Like my nature is, I am Larry and Bev Turner's son. There is absolutely nothing I can do to change that. I did not go to school to study to become Larry and Bev Turner's son. I was not hired as like an under son and then one day promoted to being their rightful son. And in the same way, Jesus, he did not go to some sort of deity school and ultimately graduate, and then he was able to become God. He wasn't hired as like an under God, and then he became God. He got a promotion. No, Jesus in his very nature, he is God. In his most natural form, he is God. And so John, he goes on and he says this, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In verse 4, and in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And so as John continues his introduction of Jesus, he gives us two more realities that are embodied in Jesus. The first one, he says that in Jesus is life. In Jesus is life. Last month sometime, I was asked by a couple of friends to do a podcast with them. They've started this podcast about what it looks like on the other side of a divorce. And one of the questions that they asked me during the podcast was, Andy, why is it that whenever everybody sins, whenever everybody messes up, why is it that we still feel so much shame whenever we sin? Why do we feel so much shame whenever we mess up? And I tried to respond as compassionately as I possibly could. But the simple answer to that question is, because sin is shameful. Sin is shameful. It has always been shameful. You go back to the very beginning with Adam and Eve. As soon as they ate the forbidden fruit, the first thing that they did is they realized that they were naked and they were filled with shame. They tried to hide. They were embarrassed. They felt guilt for the very first time. But there's something that's taken place in our world today that we've adopted this mindset of, well, everyone sins. And because everyone sins, all I have to do is I have to compare my sin to somebody else's sin. And if my sin isn't as bad as somebody else's sin, then I'm probably okay. Right? I mean, my sin, it could be a lot worse. I'm not really that bad. But as long as we create this mindset, as long as we adopt this mindset to justify our behavior, to justify our sin, we will continue to live with this lack of awareness of what sin is and what sin does. I want you to hear this. Sin leads to death. Sin leads to separation from God. Sin leads us to our place in our spirit and in our soul that we are incapable of coming back from on our own. But in Him, in Jesus, is life. And John, he gives us this little bit of foreshadowing of what's going to one day take place on the cross, of Jesus coming to be our rescuer. That the one who would come and who would make a way whenever we were incapable of making a way on our own. The one who would take on our sin and who would take on our shame on Himself. And through His life, He would give us life. But in addition to life, Jesus being life, John also tells us that Jesus is light. And one of the things that has been so consistent with God's people all throughout history, and I'll include us in that story of God's people, is that so many of God's people have always just wanted to blend in and be like everyone else whenever God has clearly said you are to be set apart. One of the clearest places we see this is shortly after the Israelites, God's people, right? They end up making their way after 40 years in the wilderness into the promised land. This land that God had promised their ancestors, and they finally get there. I mean, they have their own place. They have their place to call home. They have their nation now. But as they are there, they begin to look around at all the other surrounding nations, and they notice that all the other surrounding nations have a king. And so God's people, the Israelites, they begin to tell their leaders, well, we want a king. But the problem was that God had made a covenant with them that said that God would be their king. But they still wanted a king. And so God, He ultimately gave them a king, and they just wanted to be like everybody else. So first they had Saul, and then they had David, and then they had Solomon. But because of the sins of their leaders, they would eventually find themselves being abused and oppressed and put into slavery time and time again. And it all started with this one idea. God, yes, you've called me to be set apart. But man, we want to be like everyone else. And for us today, there's still this part of us that we are tempted to want to just be like everyone else. To look at the way, to look at the world the way that our society, that our friends, that our fellow students, that they look at the world. To where we can look at it and say that all that matters is my will and my desires and my version of right and wrong. That nobody can argue with my will and my desires and my version of right and wrong. But if you are a Jesus follower in here today, Jesus has called you to surrender your will and your desires and your version of right and wrong for His will and His desires and His version of right and wrong. And Jesus called us to do this by entering into the darkness as glorious light. And by exposing the darkness that was hovering around in this world. And by overcoming and overwhelming the darkness and all that goes along with it. And so John continues in verse 9. He says that this true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. It would allow us to finally see clearly that Jesus, whenever he came into the world, he literally put flesh and bone onto the heart of God. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. And then verse 12, if you have your own Bible out, circle this, underline it, these three little letters. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor human decision, or a husband's will, but children born of God. And so that brings up the question, right? How did Jesus do this? How did he give this rebellious, shame-filled, broken, sinful group of people the opportunity to have the right to become children of God? In verse 14, it gives us the answer, and it says, and the Word, that same word, logos, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. This spoken word of creation, this word that is filled with so much power, the word of life, the word of meaning, the word of purpose. And we have seen the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and full of truth. I think whenever I look at this that John did an incredible job introducing Jesus. But my prayer for you is that this week you get to know Jesus. Because John, he did not write this gospel just so we could learn more facts about Jesus. But John wrote this gospel so that you could know Jesus. Y'all, man, this last year has been rough. This last year has been full of so much pain and so much darkness. We've had our lives uprooted. We've had our lives ambushed by a virus. And all along the way, we've had people sowing these seeds of distrust and disunity. These seeds of fear that have been sown among us. And whenever I look out, it feels so good to just see a full room. But I know in a room this size, the stories of pain that some of you have from this past year, like there are no words to describe it. The loss of loved ones, family members who have lost jobs, family members who have been torn apart through the pain and the tension that came along with trying to survive. And if that wasn't enough, right? I mean, it's not like that's the only thing that was going on in 2020. We lived through the greatest racial and social unrest that I've ever experienced in my nearly 40 years on this earth. We went through a polarizing presidential election. And over and over and over again, we've been told, hey, if you don't agree with somebody, just move on. Just write them off. But church, that's not the heart of Jesus. The heart of Jesus is not a just write them off kind of heart. And for those of us who claim to be followers of Jesus, that can't be our heart either. Our world has been full of darkness. Our minds have been full of darkness. Our hearts have been full of darkness. But I want you to know that into the darkness steps the glorious light of Jesus Christ. And when it seems that all hope may be gone, May we stand firm on the foundation and remember that the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. I put it like this to my church all the time, that when things look their worst, God is often up to His best. And this week we may we be introduced to Jesus once again. May we be challenged by His words once again. May we be challenged by His actions. May we be challenged by His life, by His death, and by His resurrection. And may we see that we cannot be followers of Jesus and then just be like everyone else, but that our words and our actions and our lives must be different. We must be light to all. Why? Because we are called to be like Jesus. And Jesus is for all, forever.